You know how sometimes when you're climbing the tallest tree in the orchard and you get to the very top and the wind whips past your ears and you can see for miles and miles? That's kind of how I imagine it was, but a million times bigger and way, way longer ago than any story grandfather tells. This wasn't just a big tree. It was a whole world of trees, stretching out under a sun that felt hotter and brighter than ours even. And in that green, leafy world, there lived an ape. Not like the apes we see in drawings, all dark and heavy. No, this ape, whose name was Aura, was a bit different. Lighter fur, maybe, and eyes that held a spark, a kind of looking that was more than just seeing where the next ripe fruit was. Aura was part of a big family, a troop of what grandfather calls Ouranopithecus. Sounds fancy, right? But it just means they were apes who lived in a time when the world was changing. The forests were still vast, like endless green oceans, but there were signs, if you knew where to look, that the edges were getting closer. Patches of land where the trees thinned out, where the grass grew tall and shimmered like gold. Places that were both scary and, if you were like Aura, just a little bit exciting. Aura wasn't the biggest in her troop, and she wasn't the bossiest. That was usually left to Koth, a hulking male with a booming chest beat and a temper as fiery as the midday sun. Aura was more of a thinker, a watcher. She spent hours perched on high branches, her long, agile fingers wrapped around the rough bark, just observing. She'd watch the shimmering heat haze rising from the distant plains, watch the way the shadows moved across the forest floor as the sun climbed higher, watch the tiny iridescent beetles scuttling on the leaves. While the other young apes wrestled and squabbled over the plumpest berries, Aura was often lost in her own thoughts, a quiet hum of curiosity always buzzing behind her bright eyes. Her troop lived a good life in the canopy. Figs, wild plums, sweet. Berries and juicy leaves were abundant. They spent their days swinging from branch to branch with effortless grace, their powerful limbs propelling them through the air, sometimes letting out whoops of joy as they soared. The forest was their home, their shelter, their playground, and their larder. But even in this lush paradise, there were dangers. The rustle of a giant snake hidden in the leaves, the sudden shadow of a soaring eagle, or the growl of a lurking big cat. Life was rich, but it was also always on the edge of a claw or a fang. One particular morning, the air was unusually still, heavy and humid. Even the usually chirping birds were silent, as if holding their breath. Aura felt an odd prickle on her fur, a sense of unease that settled deep in her belly. Koth, usually oblivious to anything but his own desires, was also agitated, grunting nervously, his eyes darting around. The younger apes clung closer to their mothers, whimpering softly. Something was coming. Then, a low rumble started. Not thunder this time, but something deeper, more continuous. It vibrated through the very branches they clung to, making the leaves tremble. It was a sound Aura had heard before, a few times, always distant, always unsettling. The earth was moving, slowly at first, then with a growing intensity, the ground began to shake. Not violently, not like a sudden fall, but a persistent, unsettling tremor that made the world feel unstable. Panic flared through the troop. Koth let out a bellow of alarm, and the apes began to scatter, scrambling higher into the oldest, thickest trees, seeking the perceived safety of massive trunks and interwoven branches. Aura, however, found herself strangely drawn to the edge of their territory, to where the forest began to thin, where she could glimpse the plains beyond. The rumbling seemed to be coming from that direction, a vast, hungry sound. Through a gap in the foliage, she saw it. Not an animal, not a predator, but something far, far bigger. A wall of dust, rising hundreds of feet into the sky, churning and boiling, obscuring the horizon. And behind it, a sound like 1,000 drums, beating closer and closer. It wasn't just the earth shaking. It was something else shaking the earth. Suddenly, a massive ancient tree, one they had always climbed, its roots deeply embedded, began to groan. A slow, agonizing rip of wood, a sound that made Aura's fur stand on end. Then, with a deafening crash, the giant fell, tearing a huge swathe through the canopy, leaving a gaping wound in the forest like a missing tooth in a green smile. It wasn't the rumbling of the earth that caused it, Aura realized. It was something moving on the plains, something so vast, so powerful, that its passage alone caused the very ground to tear. The fallen tree exposed a vast golden swathe of savanna, now clearly visible through the shattered forest edge. And then she saw them, a herd, truly immense, of giant grazers, beasts with long necks and wide, flat teeth, moving in an endless, slow tide across the plains. They were not running in panic, but moving with a grim, determined slowness, like a river flowing to the sea. And they were moving towards the forest, towards Aura's troop, towards everything they knew. Aura instinctively recoiled, her heart pounding. The other apes who had fled deeper into the forest were now completely oblivious to this new, approaching danger. They thought they were safe, clinging to their high branches. But Aura knew, with a chilling certainty, that this herd, if it kept its course, would simply flatten everything in its path. Trees, plants, even the very ground beneath them. And her troop, huddled in what they thought was safety, would be crushed beneath the relentless march. She looked back at her family, huddled, fearful but unaware. She looked at Koth, still bellowing warnings at the empty air, oblivious to the true threat. Her gaze swept over the broken landscape, then back to the approaching wave of beasts, their hooves kicking up dust that stung her eyes and tasted of dry earth. A desperate thought, wild and half-formed, sparked in her mind. She had to warn them. But how? Her squawks and grunts would be lost in the rumbling thunder of the herd. They were too far, too high, too focused on the immediate threat of the shaking ground. She needed to do something different, something big, something that would cut through the noise and the fear. Her eyes darted around, searching. The ground was littered with broken branches, fallen leaves, and most importantly, stones. Rounded stones, sharp stones, stones of all shapes and sizes, dislodged by the falling tree. Her gaze fixed on a particular rock, one that had cleaved in half, leaving a rough, flat face and a remarkably keen edge. It was almost the size of her head, too heavy to lift with one hand, but she could push it. Sudden, deeper rumble, closer this time, vibrated through her bones. The leading edge of the herd was nearing the shattered tree line, their enormous bodies already casting vast shadows over the first rows of untouched trees. Time was running out. Aura knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that if she didn't act now, her troop, her family, would be obliterated. She had to make them see. She had to make them understand. She looked at the sharp-edged stone, then at the vast open wound in the forest where the tree had fallen. It was a path, a way to send a message. But what kind of message? She gripped the large, sharp-edged stone with both hands, muscles straining, and with a desperate surge of strength, she pushed it towards the edge of the newly formed clearing. It scraped and slid over the rocky ground, leaving a faint trail. As she pushed it, a smaller, sharper fragment broke off, tumbling ahead of it. This was not about finding food or fighting a single predator. This was about something much larger. This was about survival, not just for her, but for all of them. And in this desperate moment, on the very edge of their known world, Aura felt a new, exhilarating surge of determination. She would not let the green sea drown her family. She would make a new path. But what exactly could a single ape do against a living tide of thunderous beasts? The answer, she knew, lay in the ingenious whisper of the fractured stone she held and in the terrifying courage she would need to make her voice heard above the coming storm. Aura's muscles screamed with effort. The stone, heavy and unyielding, resisted her push, scraping a raw line through the loose earth and tangled roots that littered the clearing. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her chest heaving, but she didn't. Stop! The rumbling grew louder, a deep, continuous thrumming that resonated in her very bones, 1,000 heartbeats of colossal beasts. The air, already thick with humidity, now carried the pungent scent of dust and the sharp, grassy smell of the approaching herd. Her eyes, wide and fixed on the horizon, saw the dust cloud swelling, growing taller, closer, a monstrous brown wave ready to engulf everything. The fallen tree, now a gaping wound in the forest, created a natural channel, a direct line from the plains into the heart of their ancient home. The herd, driven by instinct and the relentless press of those behind them, seemed to be funneling directly into this new, destructive path. They were not malicious, not hunting, but simply moving, an unstoppable force of nature. And Aura's troop, high in the canopy, were like small, ignorant birds perched on a branch that was about to be snapped. Koth's bellows of alarm had turned into whimpers of confusion, still directed at the general shaking of the ground, not the specific, overwhelming threat of the herd. Aura knew she had to make a sound, a signal that would cut through their fear and draw their attention to the true danger. But what? Her usual calls were too small, too easily lost in the roaring silence of the approaching herd. She pushed the large, sharp-edged stone with renewed desperation. It was still too slow. She needed something else, something bigger, louder. Her gaze darted to a cluster of ancient, moss-covered boulders dislodged from the earth by the same seismic shifts that had brought down the massive tree. They were enormous, immovable. But what if she could make them move? Not the boulders themselves, but something from them. Her eyes fell on a precariously balanced slab of rock, wedged between two larger, unyielding boulders. It looked unstable, teetering on a thin edge. An idea, half-formed and audacious, sparked in her mind, even wilder than the last. If she could dislodge it, if it could crash down, that would be a sound. A sound that even Koth, deep in his panicked tree, could not ignore. She abandoned the large stone she had been pushing, a new urgency seizing her. She scrambled towards the cluster of boulders, her nimble fingers and strong limbs helping her clamber over the rough, broken earth. The ground vibrated violently now, making it hard to keep her footing. The first, enormous bodies of the herd were now visible, dark shapes emerging from the dust, their long necks swaying rhythmically as they marched. They were so close. She reached the precarious slab. It was rough, cold under her hands, covered in slippery moss. She pushed, grunting, with effort testing its balance. It shifted, a faint grinding sound echoing in the oppressive quiet. It was heavy, too heavy to push with brute force. But she remembered the smaller, sharper fragment that had broken off the stone she had been pushing earlier, the one with the keen edge. It was still tucked carefully into the fold of fur near her belly, a precious hidden thing. She pulled it out, her fingers clumsy with haste and adrenaline. She looked at the sharp edge, then at the crack where the slab was wedged. Could she wedge it deeper? Could she use this smaller piece to loosen the larger one? It was a gamble. It meant putting her hands, her precious, clever hands, right into the path of danger. The ground shuddered again, more violently this time. A nearby, smaller tree snapped with a sickening crack as one of the giant grazers leaned against it, oblivious. Aura saw it, heard it, and knew she had no more time. With desperate speed, she inserted the sharp fragment into the narrow crack where the slab met the ground. She pushed, twisted, then leveraged her full body weight against it. The sharp edge, bit into the softer stone, scraping, grinding, slowly widening the fissure. Her hands ached, her muscles burned, but she persisted, driven by the image of her troop, oblivious and doomed. Then, with a sudden, horrifying lurch, the slab began to move, slowly at first, then gaining momentum. It tilted forward, scraping against the boulders it had been trapped between. Aura pulled her hands back just in time, her heart leaping into her throat. The slab crashed down with a deafening roar, a sound, like 1,000 crashing trees all at once. It hit the ground with immense force, sending up a geyser of dust and small rocks, and splitting into several jagged pieces with a series of sharp, reverberating cracks. The sound was not just loud, it was primal, shocking, an unnatural clamor that ripped through the air, vibrating through the very canopy where the apes were huddled. High above, in the thickest branches, Koth, who had been bellowing meaningless, alarms suddenly fell silent. His head snapped up, his eyes wide. The other apes, startled by the immense crash, chattered frantically, their eyes darting, trying to understand the source of this new, terrifying sound. For a moment, their attention shifted from the general rumbling to the specific explosive noise that had just rent the air. Aura, covered in dust, panting, looked up at her troop. They were looking at the gaping wound in the forest, where the slab had crashed, where the dust still billowed. And then, slowly, their eyes began to discern the monstrous shapes emerging from the dust beyond the clearing. The herd, a chorus of shocked squawks and terrified grunts erupted from the troop. They finally saw it, the true danger. Koth, for the first time, seemed to grasp the enormity of the threat. His chest puffed up, but his usual booming roar was replaced by a series of desperate, high-pitched cries of terror. The herd was almost upon them, their vast bodies already brushing against the outermost trees of the forest. Aura, still on the ground, amidst the shattered stone and rising dust, saw their terror. But she also saw something else, a flicker of understanding, a sudden, desperate movement. They began to scramble, not just higher into the trees, but away from the path of the herd, deeper into the untouched parts of the forest, guided by their raw, panicked instinct to escape. Her loud crash had worked. It had drawn their attention to the true danger, diverted their blind flight, and given them a chance. But the herd was relentless. The first enormous grazer pushed through the shattered tree line, its massive head tearing at the remaining foliage, its wide, flat feet crushing everything beneath them. The forest floor groaned under their collective weight. Aura knew she couldn't stay on the ground. She had to climb, and fast. She scrambled up the nearest sturdy tree, her long, agile fingers finding purchase on the rough bark. She climbed higher, and higher. The sounds of the herd's relentless advance growing louder, the very tree she clung to trembling violently. From her perch, she saw the full scale of the disaster unfolding. Trees, some of them ancient, were being flattened. Their branches snapped like twigs. The green world was being consumed by a moving tide of muscle and hide. Aura's troop, a chaotic mass of fur and limbs, was scrambling frantically, trying to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the destruction. They were moving, but slowly, hampered by the thick canopy and their own panicked disorganization. Koth was still bellowing, but his cries were now laced with sheer terror. Aura looked back at the path of the herd, then at the direction her troop was fleeing. They were moving, yes, but not fast enough. The herd was a wide, sweeping current, not a narrow stream. If they continued in that direction, they would still be caught, eventually, by the relentless, expanding wave of destruction. She needed to do something more, something to create a stronger diversion, a clearer path. Her gaze fell upon the sharp fragment of stone she had used to dislodge the slab. It was still clutched in her hand. It was small, almost insignificant. But she knew its power. It could cut. It could shape. It could break. And around her, high in the tree. She saw the thick, fibrous vines that linked the trees together, the very arteries of the forest. If she could cut some of these, if she could bring down parts of the canopy, a desperate, daring plan formed in her mind. It was reckless, dangerous, but it was the only way. She had to create a new barrier, a new obstacle to divert the herd, to buy her troop more time. She started to move, not deeper into the forest, but along the edge of the destruction, towards a place where a cluster of particularly thick, vine-entwined trees stood directly in the herd's path. She reached a thick vine, as wide as her arm, that stretched between two ancient trees. It was far too thick to snap with her hands, far too strong to bite through. But she had the sharp stone. She pressed the keen edge against the vine, her teeth gritted, and began to saw, slowly, meticulously. It was arduous work, the tough fibers, resisting her every movement. But she pushed through the pain, driven by the urgency of the moment, the thunder of the approaching herd. Below her, the ground vibrated violently, and the scent of the approaching beasts grew overwhelming. The first of the giant grazers was almost directly beneath her, its enormous body swaying, its wide mouth tearing at the low-hanging branches. Aura worked frantically, sawing at the vine, her sharp stone biting deeper and deeper into the tough fiber. She could feel the vibration of the beast's breathing, the warmth of its massive body. One wrong move, one slip, and she would be crushed. With a final desperate surge of strength, the vine groaned, stretched, and then, with a tearing sound, finally began to part. The colossal branch, thick as an ancient tree trunk itself and laden with its own smaller limbs and leafy burden, groaned with the final agony of severed connection. It swayed, a momentary pause in its descent, as if drawing a last, shuddering breath before it plunged. Aura, still perched on the vine she had so painstakingly cut, knew she had mere heartbeats. The massive grazer below, a towering wall of hide and muscle, continued its relentless advance, oblivious to the impending doom from above. Its enormous head, fringed with long, coarse hair, brushed against the very branches Aura clung to, and the hot, rank breath of the beast washed over her, a primal stench of earth and vegetation. Her fur bristled, her every instinct screaming to flee, to leap, to do anything but remain in the path of this monstrous falling timber. But where could she go? The herd behind the lead grazer was a solid, living tide, pushing forward with unstoppable force. To drop to the forest floor meant instant death under 1,000 crushing hooves. To swing back towards her troop meant heading into an area that was only moments away from being consumed. The only way was forward, or, more accurately, sideways, along the very edge of the destruction, hoping to find a gap, a small mercy in the chaos. With a desperate cry, a raw, almost human sound of terror and determination, Aura pushed off the crumbling vine. Her powerful limbs, honed by a lifetime in the canopy, propelled her outward, a desperate leap into the unknown. She stretched, her fingers reaching, clawing for the nearest sturdy branch, anything that wasn't part of the collapsing canopy. The air rushed past her ears, the roar of the falling branch deafening behind her. A sound like the world itself was tearing apart. She felt the sharp sting of splinters as her hands scraped against rough bark, missed her grip. And then, a desperate, last-second lunge, and her fingers found purchase on a thinner, whiplash-like branch. It bent alarmingly under her sudden weight, but it held. She swung wildly, momentum carrying her in a frantic arc away from the descending doom. Behind her, with a thunderous crash that shook the very foundations of the forest, the severed branch hit the ground. It didn't merely fall. It exploded downwards, splintering other trees, sending a shockwave of sound and debris through the air. The colossal grazer beneath it, caught entirely unaware, bellowed in pain and shock as the immense weight struck its back. Its long neck buckled, its legs splayed, and it stumbled, a mountain of flesh collapsing with a groaning, tearing sound. It was not dead but clearly injured, a massive thrashing obstacle in the path of the relentlessly advancing herd. Dust, thicker than any she had ever seen, billowed upwards, turning the dappled sunlight into a murky, choking haze. The scent of crushed leaves, broken wood, and the acrid tang of disturbed earth filled the air. The herd behind the injured beast reacted with immediate, instinctual panic. The orderly march was broken. Those behind, unable to see the cause of the sudden stop, pressed forward, creating a terrible, confused tangle of enormous bodies. They bellowed, confused and distressed, their massive hooves churning the ground into a muddy, broken mess. Aura, clinging precariously to her slender branch, coughed, her lungs burning from the dust. She peered through the swirling haze. Her drastic action had worked perhaps too well. A wall of fallen branches, splintered trunks, and the writhing body of the injured grazer now blocked the primary path of the herd, creating a churning, chaotic bottleneck. The sheer force of their numbers meant they couldn't simply stop. They had to divert. And as Aura watched, she saw the leading edge of the herd slowly, grudgingly, begin to turn. They were shifting, a massive living current finding a new path. Slightly to the side, away from the immediate impenetrable barrier she had created, but the diversion was not complete. The herd was so vast, so wide, that even a significant portion of it still threatened the very edges of the untouched forest, the direction in which her troop had fled. Aura's gaze swept desperately towards them. They were still moving, a frantic, disorganized retreat, their calls now a mixture of relief and continued fear. They had gained precious moments, perhaps even a clear line of escape. But the danger was far from over. Aura still clutched the sharp stone in her hand, a tiny, invaluable sliver of power. She looked at the new path the herd was forging, a widening swath of destruction that would still consume portions of the forest. She needed to do something more, something to push them further away, to create a greater buffer for her troop. Her eyes darted around, searching for a new opportunity, a new point of leverage. The ground beneath her was now a chaos of broken earth and splintered wood. The air vibrated with the continuous low rumble of the herd and the occasional sharp cracks of breaking branches. She saw a deep fissure in the earth, exposed by the fallen tree, a dark, winding crack that seemed to snake downwards, disappearing into the gloomy depths below. It was a natural fault line, perhaps, and then she saw it. Along the edge of the fissure, a line of trees, massive and ancient, stood perilously close to the edge. Their roots were exposed, clinging precariously to the crumbling earth. If she could make those trees fall, perhaps even just one or two, they would create an even wider barrier, forcing the herd to turn even more drastically away from her troop's escape route. But how? She couldn't cut their massive trunks. Her sharp stone was powerful, but it was not enough for that. She looked at the exposed roots, thick as her body, twisting like sleeping snakes. They were anchored, deep and strong. But if the ground itself could be made to shift, if the fissure could be widened, a desperate, audacious idea ignited in her mind. It was a terrifying concept, one that went against every instinct of safety and self-preservation. She would have to go down into the fissure, to the very edge of the earth's raw power. She carefully lowered herself from the high branch, her nimble feet finding tiny grips on the rough bark. The air grew cooler as she descended, smelling of damp earth and ancient stone. She reached the edge of the fissure, a jagged, dark mouth in the earth. It was deep, deeper than she could see, and the bottom was shrouded in shadows. She could hear the faint drip of water, the scuttle of unseen creatures. It was a place of darkness and unknown dangers, but it was also a place of immense power. The very earth was unstable here. She looked at the exposed roots of the ancient trees clinging to the edge of the fissure. If she could somehow dislodge the earth around them, if she could weaken their hold. She began to crawl along the crumbling edge, her body pressed low, her sharp stone clutched tightly in her hand. She found a spot where the earth was particularly loose, a section that seemed to be eroding, constantly shedding small stones and dirt into the abyss below. She began to dig, not with the sharp edge, but with the broader, flat side of the stone, pushing and scraping, forcing more earth to fall into the fissure. It was slow, painstaking work, and the ground felt treacherous beneath her. Each movement caused a small shower of pebbles to tumble into the darkness, echoing faintly. The thunder of the herd was still a monstrous presence above her, a constant vibrating reminder of the urgency of her task. She could hear the frustrated bellows of the lead grazers as they struggled against the barrier of fallen trees and the injured beast. They were pushing, relentlessly, testing the limits of her makeshift wall. Aura worked with a feverish intensity, her mind focused entirely on the task. She dug at the earth, scraping away the loose soil, trying to expose more of the supporting roots. Her hands were raw, her nails broken, but she felt no pain, only the driving need to succeed. She needed to create a bigger obstacle, a larger diversion, before the herd broke through and consumed the last haven of her troop. Suddenly, a larger section of earth, loosened by her efforts, gave way with a sickening crack. It wasn't a small slide. It was a substantial chunk of the fissure's edge, crumbling into the darkness, taking with it a cluster of small rocks and some of the smaller anchoring roots of the ancient trees. The ground around her trembled violently, and a fine dust, mixed with the acrid scent of sulfur, rose from the depths. The trees above her, their major roots now partially exposed and weakened, began to lean. Slowly, majestically, they tilted, their ancient limbs swaying against the sky. Aura looked up, her heart pounding. It was working, but she was still too close. The crumbling earth, the groaning trees, the terrifying depth of the fissure. She was in a perilous position, trapped between the falling giants and the unseen dangers below. She heard a new sound, distinct from the herd's rumble and the falling earth. The frantic chattering of her troop, closer now, their calls echoing through. The still-standing trees. They had come back. Drawn by the cacophony, or perhaps by some instinct to find her, they were now dangerously close to the very edge of the collapsing forest. Koth's bellows were loud, filled with a mixture of anger and confusion. He saw the falling trees, the shifting earth. He saw Aura, a tiny figure clinging to the edge of the abyss, seemingly at the heart of the chaos. Aura braced herself, her small body pressed against the remaining stable earth. The first of the ancient trees began to fall, its immense trunk tearing away from the soil with a sound like ripping fabric, then plunging downwards with a terrible groaning crash.